In developmental projects and research projects regarding FGM prevention, the role of men in affecting change is pointed out more often. Might the best way to involve men have to do with including them among those whose bodily integrity and genital autonomy is also protected and promoted? I'm not sure about that. I will say that the suggestion that it's up to men to step up and try to end FGM is a little bit problematic in that it suggests that the women are not capable of deciding to end this practice themselves. This goes back to something I said earlier about the context in which these rituals are performed in virtually every society that performs them, which is that the female genital cutting rite is almost always managed, controlled, perpetuated, and most strongly supported by women. So it's the mothers and the grandmothers who authorize, elicit, or sometimes carry out the genital cutting of the girls in the very same way that the men control the parallel ceremony for boys. And so you often find that the men in a given society actually do prefer either less invasive forms of female genital cutting because they don't want their sexual partners to be injured, because that's not enjoyable for either of them, or they prefer the complete elimination of the ritual. And you will find that it is the women who, in most cases, most strongly defend the practice. Now, there's various psychological reasons for why that might be, and there's a whole long conversation we could have. But the recent work by the anthropologist Bettina Schell Duncan, who's very carefully studied this issue, suggests that female genital cutting is, in the majority of societies that practice it, what she calls women's business or women's work. Maybe I'll put this in a broader context just because I imagine that that's counterintuitive to many people. There's a general pattern that anthropologists have observed, which is that every society that practices female genital cutting also practices male genital cutting, but not vice versa. So again, within Judaism, within some sects of Islam, but not others, among Americans, only the boys have a genital cutting ritual that they're subjected to, and girls are excluded from what, at least within Judaism, is seen as the most important ritual of the religion. In the African context, then, what's been suggested is that the female rite of passage was introduced in imitation of the pre-existing male ritual, which was widely understood to be a source of power and privilege, whereby boys were transformed into men who could thereby take on the various political and social privileges that adults were entitled to. And girls didn't have a comparable ritual that they could use to transform into women and to have their own process of solidarity by going through an initiation, a rite of passage together. So what many people argue is that the point of these rites of passage or these initiations is that they promote solidarity among the age group of initiates. It's similar to the way of how a hazing ritual works in a fraternity. If you go through a horrible experience and you survive it, you must think to yourself, it must have been worth it to go through that, because then I get to be a part of this great group. And so then you have to internalize that, and then you carry out the practice on the next generation. So the women in many of these societies are under a very similar kind of a logic. There is their own parallel ritual, which men are almost invariably excluded from, often don't know much about, are certainly not allowed to participate in. And the wisdom of the mothers and the grandmothers is handed down from generation to generation. And the age group of girls undergo a initiation that's comparable to what the boys do. And depending on the group, either form of cutting is more or less severe. That depends on the specific situation. And then the thought is that it's promoting solidarity and bonding among them. And so for that reason, they're not going to want to give it up, because again, you have to internalize the thought that that must have been worth it. This is a good thing. It allows me to be a part of the community. It's what bonds me to my sisters. And so it's already the case that men are often, sometimes under pressure from Western authorities, insofar as the men have more political power in the community, is doing things like passing laws that are anti-FGM laws. But these don't cause FGM to go away. It causes it to go underground, where the women continue the practice amongst themselves, but they'll do a less severe form of it so it can't be detected. They'll do it to younger girls so that they can't remember it. So they're starting to do it to little baby girls on the model of US Americans who do it to little baby boys. So it's not even a rite of passage anymore. It's losing its symbolic value, but they're continuing to do it because it's their practice. So the general lesson from this is that there's no way that these global elimination campaigns are going to be successful in causing women to stop promoting female genital cutting within their societies if they continue to badly misunderstand why the practice is done and its history and its the role that it plays within an overall gendered social system. Just as further comment about this, In the West, we have a notion of patriarchy, which is male dominance over women. And we tend to think of society as hierarchically organized in terms of gender, because in many respects, that's what's going on in our cultural history. But starting in the 1970s, when there was an attempt to establish a notion of a global sisterhood where we were all being oppressed in the same way, white Western feminists went into African villages and imposed their notion of a gender hierarchy into societies that are not necessarily organized along those lines. So in many in many West African cultures, the hierarchy is often more to do with age or seniority to do with status along other dimensions than merely gendered ones. These things are intersectional and interdependent, and lines of power trace along very many different lines. But there was this homogenizing tendency to reduce all of these extremely diverse communities into the same two-dimensional framework that was being used to try to fight important battles in Western politics, to advocate for women's rights in societies that were hierarchically organized along gendered lines. And then there was just bad anthropology happening, where the assumption was this is exactly what must be going on to all women everywhere in every culture, regardless of the specifics. And so you had people like Fran Hoskin, who went into Northeast Africa and was looking at the most severe forms of female genital cutting, and just simply assumed that this must be being done, on behalf of the men who are trying to control the women and so forth. There are some societies that practice female genital cutting that are highly patriarchal, but there's no consistent relationship between the degree of gender inequality in a given society and whether or not it practices genital cutting. For example, some of the most patriarchal societies, like Orthodox Judaism, only cut the genitals of boys, and girls, as I say, are excluded from the privilege of having their genitals cut. So it's not a viable theory, and yet, amazingly, this is what everyone knows about the practice, is it's all about trying to control girls' sexuality. I don't think most people know that there's no society that singles out girls for genital cutting, and that the symbolic meanings are multifarious, they change over time. There may be conscious and unconscious reasons for doing it. The reasons why it was done 1,000 years ago may be different to why it's done in a hospital today, and so forth. So again, all of that is very, very confused, but there's a major gap between what scholars of these topics have good reason to think about what's going on, and what kind of everybody knows in the general discourse, which is what shapes policy and kind of perpetuates itself by being just the narrative that we have. It's a very comfortable narrative. It's what they do over there is barbaric, and they're horrible people who want to harm and injure and mutilate their daughters. Most people don't realize they're also cutting their sons. Whereas what our culture is invisible because it's the norm, it's the standard. What we do is permissible and acceptable and fine, and we don't want to have to look at our own backyard and consider whether we might be doing something that's a little bit barbaric. And so it's a very comforting thing, and it's couched in a kind of righteous concern for the welfare of little girls, but it's based on theories that are completely untenable if you look at the diversity of genital cutting practices across societies, and if you look at the complex history and the social functions and purposes for which they're done.